My name is Joel Towers. I'm the Dean of Parsons, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to the final session of our conference on climate change. The climate change demands we change, why aren't we? And before we begin this session, I wanted to ask Catherine Willis to just make a quick announcement about some activities after the conference. Before she does, I just want you all to know, if you do get the opportunity to look at the New School's website and see the many, many things that are going on around climate change within the university, you will find a site around C6, a group of faculty and staff from across the university have gotten together, in fact, following Hurricane Sandy, as we talked a little bit about in the last session. And that website and any of the good work that we've been able to achieve has been significantly aided by Catherine's efforts. She produced that site. So we owe her a great deal of thanks, and she'll now invite you, I believe, to some activities. So, Catherine.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the conference. I hope it's been a great experience. I have certainly learned a lot, and it's inspired many conversations. We would like to continue the conversation after the conference, so immediately at 4 p.m. until 6:30 p.m. this evening. The Sustainable Cities Club, of which I'm also a member, and the Sustainability Office are hosting a reception in the Social Justice Hub. So it's on the 5th floor of this building, and it's kind of hard to find, but if you go up to the 5th floor and you walk around until you see a lot of people with pizza, you've gotten to the right place. So we want to continue these conversations, particularly with regard to social and environmental justice, and hope to see you there.
We are a university after all, so pizza and social justice go together. It's again, thank you all for coming. Being the final panel of 4 panels over 2 days is never an easy task, but we have a really fantastic group of experts with us today to address the final question that we have put forth, which is really about the difficult choices that need to be made. How will they be made in relationship to climate change and the sorts of changes it will bring forth. What I would like to say in some, sort of the last session to question even the very premise we put forward at the beginning, which is to say that we aren't changing. I think it's inaccurate to suggest that we aren't changing. I think, in fact, many changes have taken place and continue to take place. The question really before us is, are we changing fast enough? And are we making changes in the right places? Who wins and who loses in the changes that are being made so far? How do we make those determinations with a perspective towards environmental and social justice? What does it mean for cities and rural areas and the relationship between those? And I think our panel today will touch on many of these points. I think they are really at the core of understanding how humanity responds to climate change. The university that we are gathered in here at the New School is in many ways focused on precisely these questions. And so I think it is fitting that we end the discussions of the 2 days in this area. And in particular, it's not just the question of environmental justice, which is at the core, I think, the heart really of the issues around climate change, but that these actions are playing out in urban environments, that cities are play such a critical role within the question of climate change. And so our panel today in many ways brings together cities and environmental justice, and without further ado, I really would like to begin the discussion. We will have hopefully 4 presentations once Russell gets here. Each speaker will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will go to some questions and answers as we have throughout the day. If you're just arriving for the first time for this, we do encourage you to make your questions truly questions, not just statements, and then we will be using the microphones on either end to try to respond to them. So I will introduce each of the speakers in turn, and then they will come to the podium and make their talk, and then we will hold all questions until the end when everybody has completed their presentation. We will begin with Dale Jamieson, Professor of Environmental Studies and Philosophy and Affiliated Professor of Law. Formerly, Dale was the Henry Luce Professor in Human Dimensions of Global Change at Carleton College and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he was the only faculty member to win both the Dean's Award for Research in the Social Sciences and the Chancellor's Award for Research in the Humanities. He has held visiting appointments at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, Cornell, Princeton, Stanford, Oregon, Arizona State University, and Monash University in Australia. He is also past president of the International Society for Environmental Ethics. Jamieson is the author of Reason in a Dark Time, Why the Struggle to Stop Climate Change Failed and Why Our Choices Still Matter, most recently, 2014. Ethics and the Environment, an Introduction in 2008, and Morality's Progress, Essays on Humans, Other Animals, and the Rest of Nature from 2002. He is also the editor or co-editor of 9 books, most recently Reflecting on Nature, Readings in Environmental Philosophy, with Lori Gurin and Chris Schultenmann. He has also published more than 100 articles and book chapters. He's on the editorial boards of several journals, including Environmental Ethics, Science, Technology, and Human Values, Science and Engineering, Ethics, Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science, and the Journal of Agricultural and Environmental Ethics. His research has been funded by the NSF, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Office of Global Programs in the National Atmospheric and Aeronautics Administration. It's a pleasure to welcome Dale Jamieson.
All right. So, I began working on climate change more than 30 years ago. And at that time, I was just a sort of respectable academic philosopher who fell in with a bad lot of climate modelers from NCAR. And I thought that the problem of climate change was an intellectually interesting problem, but I didn't actually think it was going to turn out to be the kind of problem that it has become. And I certainly didn't think that it would turn out to be the focus of much of my academic career. In particular, although the physics, and we will go into this, but although the physics of climate change are pretty clear and pretty straightforward, the system itself is highly complex, and it seemed reasonably plausible back in the 1980s to think that there would be some feedback in the system that would serve to neutralize the injection of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And if that didn't work, it certainly seemed to be the case that the adults somewhere would actually fix the problem. And I have to say, in my defense, I mean, admittedly, this was a sort of naive thought, you know, kid from California, child of the 60s and all that. But back in the 80s, the adults had managed to succeed in addressing the problem of chlorofluorocarbons, the problem of ozone depletion. So there was some reason for optimism in those days that perhaps we don't have today. But alas, I turned out to be wrong. And instead, what we have is decades of failure. And recently, I've been trying to think through that failure, and it's the topic of a book that just came out, Reason in a Dark Time. And there's a lot to be said about why we've failed to address climate change. But one point that I think that is neglected is simply that it's not only a really, really, really hard problem, but it's actually an unprecedented problem. And much that we try to do when we think about climate change is to try to fit it into boxes with which we're familiar. And to some extent, that's inevitable. And to some extent, that can even be helpful. I mean, after all, we have to act on the basis of something we understand. But in other respects, it can lead us astray, because we can see the climate change problem as if it were just another example of some other problem that's familiar to us. So today, I just want to talk about one of these areas where I think we try to fit the climate change problem into a box that it doesn't fit very neatly, and that is the frame of justice. Now, I want to say at the outset that I'm not denying that climate change poses profound problems of justice. Indeed, I edited a book called Climate Ethics, and I spent part of my misbegotten youth wandering around the country denouncing people for their immoral behavior with respect to climate change. Rather, what I want to say is that the notions of justice and ethics that are in play in the climate case are really significantly different from the notions of justice and ethics that we deploy in other areas. And that's part of why, at least for many aspects of the problem, it's been very difficult for the rhetoric of ethics and justice to really get a grip. Now, there are some areas that we'll hear talks about later in this panel where I think the rhetoric of ethics and justice does get a grip. I'm going to be talking about certain aspects of the climate change problem where I think it doesn't, and in fact, in some ways can be misleading. Now, when we talk about global justice, we're essentially talking about justice between states. And we should remind ourselves that the Framework Convention on Climate Change is, after all, composed of states. It's an agreement between states that has established a secretariat which acts to administer the convention. And the Framework Convention differentiates responsibilities among what it calls developed countries, economies in transition, the old communist countries, and developing countries. So when we talk about the international negotiation, we're talking about states and agreements between states. And I think in particular, it's often forgotten that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is an intergovernmental panel. It is not an international panel. Every word of the IPCC reports is approved by national governments. So at one level, the whole process, the whole international process, is essentially a process among states. And we often hear, in the context of the negotiations, the rhetoric of global justice being applied in the climate change context. So Yoweri Museveni, the president of Uganda, said many years ago, when he was president of Uganda, he's managed to maintain his presidency for many years now, famously said, "Climate change is an act of aggression by the rich against the poor." By that he meant the rich countries against the poor countries. And most provocatively, Lumumba Stanislaus Diaping, who was the chief negotiator of the G77 in Copenhagen. The G77 is essentially the bloc of less developed countries that negotiate together in conjunction with China. And in Copenhagen, he said, "What is Obama going to tell his daughters? That their Kenyan relatives' lives are not worth anything." It's unfortunate that after 500 years plus of interaction with the West, we Africans are still considered disposables. And then he said the Copenhagen Accord is a solution based on the same values that funneled 6 million people in Europe into furnaces. He is not a man to understate his points. Now, as you would expect from an Oxford-educated gentleman. Now, there's a lot to be said for this way of looking at things. Now, so the next two graphs I'm going to show you are from an old report by the World Health Organization. And you know, I'm not at all concerned with the details. It's the general patternings. So what this graph shows you is essentially greenhouse gas emissions by country in 2000. And essentially, the redder the color, the more the emissions. So what you see, and this takes land use changes into account, so what you see is just what you would expect, that it's essentially, for the most part, the countries of the north are high-emitting countries. Where you see yellow and light green, the countries of the south, you see very little by way of emissions. Now, compare that graph to estimated deaths attributed to climate change by the year 2000. And by the way, it will come as a surprise to many people that by 2000, the World Health Organization was already claiming that there were significant deaths as a result of climate change. Controversial claim, but worth noting. So essentially, this map is the inverse of the previous map. That essentially what you see is very low mortality, if at all, in the countries of the North, and very high mortality in the countries of the South. So this really looks like data that confirms Museveni's claim that essentially climate change is an injustice committed by the countries of the North and the countries of the South. But if we start thinking through this more carefully, I think we see that there are some very important disanalogies between normal cases of global injustices and the climate change case. So consider a sort of paradigm case, I'm going to get some water here, of what we think of as a global injustice. Think of Hitler, the Germans invading Poland, or Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, or fill in your favorite American invasion if you'd like. Now, in those kinds of cases, there are some features that are quite different than in the climate change case. So in the case of climate change, some nations that cause harms actually claim ignorance about climate change. Well, you know, we're emitting this carbon, we don't actually know that it produces these harms, and so on and so forth. I mean, normally when you invade a country, you don't, oh, we're invading you? Oh, really? We hadn't noticed, right? I mean, the point is to notice. The point isn't somehow to be ignorant about this. And in the case of some nice, well-behaved liberal countries in the European Union and among the Scandinavian countries, not only do they continue to emit carbon, thus presumably committing the global injustice, but they're also being very nice to the people who are dying and suffering as a result of their carbon emissions by transferring resources in various ways, so on and so forth. So it's as if in an invasion where, you know, one country is bombing the cities of a country while also rebuilding the cities at the same time. It's very odd behavior in a case of standard global injustice. And moreover, we actually want some countries at this point in history to emit more carbon than they are in fact emitting. And I'll even mention the controversial case of China because we tend to think of China as kind of the universal global bad boy in a whole range of issues. But it's sobering to be reminded that there are about 100 million people in China who still don't have access to the electrical grid. So this is not a country that is even entirely electrified at this point. Then finally, the harms of global climate change are not intentionally inflicted. I mean, if in fact we could, you know, continue to make all kinds of widgets and dollies and pet rocks and, you know, color TVs, and all of this was done in a way that didn't change the global climate, we'd be really, really happy about that. Actually, when you invade a country, you would be very unhappy if your invasion didn't result in smashing things and killing people. I mean, that's actually the whole point of the invasion. So there are these pretty obvious disanalogies between the kind of standard cases of global injustices and what goes on in climate change. But the most important difference really is that it is individual people who contribute to climate change and suffer the consequences. And they're distributed throughout all the countries of the world, albeit in different proportions. So here's a slide from a group at Princeton that essentially shows that the richest 500 million people on the planet essentially emit half the world's fossil carbon. And you know, that calculation may have changed a little in the last 3 or 4 years since this paper was published. You can go further, 600, 700, 800 million people, and get rid of more fossil carbon. The point of this slide is really to show that you could really, if you could control the behavior of a relatively small fraction of the global population, you could actually leave everybody else alone, right? Because they're contributing very little to the problem. Now, where are these 500 million people, besides in this room? This is a pretty good down payment if you want to find some. But generally, where are they? Well, it's actually not easy to find, but one way of trying to figure this out is by tracing automobiles. And that's because, not because cars are so terrible, but because, although they are, but because anybody who can afford a car is quite likely to also have electrical appliances, to have heating systems, and so on and so forth. So people who own automobiles are likely to be in that global cluster whose behavior you would actually like to control if you wanted to get a handle on carbon emissions. And it turns out that car ownership, in terms of numbers, is not distributed in the same way that the Framework Convention on Climate Change distinguishes between developed and developing countries and countries that have obligations and countries that don't have obligations. It turns out, for example, that countries like China, Brazil, and India that don't have very strong obligations under the FCCC actually have more of these high emitters whose behavior you want to control, whoops, what have I done, than almost any country in Europe. Remind me later. No, I don't want to be reminded at all. Okay, skip this version, right? Okay, thank you. Okay, right, so when you're talking about the people who are living lifestyles, then they're distributed that contribute meaningfully to climate change. They're distributed in all countries of the world, and even though they occur in lower proportions in countries like Brazil, China, and India, absolutely there are more of them there than there are in most European and Australasian countries. Okay, now John Nolt, who's a philosopher at the University of Tennessee, now he's talking about we 500 million or 800 million, he's talking about us. If you take, if you look at IPCC reports and damages, and you sort of add up these damages of loss of life and so on, and then divide it by emissions, and then look at American emissions, the average American is responsible through his or her greenhouse gas emissions for the suffering or deaths of 1 or 2 future people. Now, and that's going to be true for these hundreds of millions of people distributed around the world. Now, I want to tell you about my trip to San Diego. So last weekend, I went to San Diego. And I had a very nice weekend, thank you. And thanks for asking. And in flying to San Diego and back, I was responsible for about the same level, slightly less than the annual average emissions of a Brazilian, and significantly more than the average annual emissions of most people who live in Latin America. Now, how do I feel about that? Well, I don't feel very good about that. I feel, if you wanted to call me a hypocrite, I could accept that. I don't feel, do I feel self-indulgent? Yes, I certainly feel self-indulgent. Right? I feel all of those things. It's only confession that makes me feel better. Do I feel like a murderer? No, I don't feel like a murderer. Even I, who fly around the world, I've flown to Perth, Australia to give them lectures about how bad it is to emit carbon. And even I don't feel like a murderer when I get on an airplane and am responsible for these emissions. What's going on here? Well, other than me being a bad person. I mean, I suspect most of you are bad people like me in this way, too. You may feel bad about doing these things, but you don't feel like a mafia hitman or something. Well, I think what's going on is that we have an ethical system, common sense morality, that we've inherited that is pretty hardwired into our systems, which doesn't really moralize this kind of behavior in the way that it moralizes behavior that has other kind of structure. So I'm going to go through this very quickly. I have 5 minutes. So the paradigm case of something we think is morally wrong, we can get very upset about, is Jack intentionally stealing Jill's bicycle. Yes, Jack, that jerk, he did something wrong. Jill has been harmed, lost her bike, right? Intentional, no problem. But when we vary this case on various dimensions, what happens, I think, is that our perception of the immorality of the action begins to fade. And by the time we get to example 6, acting independently, Jack and a large number of unacquainted people set in motion a chain of events that causes a large number of future people who will live in another part of the world from ever having bikes. This kind of moral clarity we had about that jerk Jack has sort of evaporated. We said we have this very complicated case that looks like business as usual. Well, what I want to say is that the case of me getting on an airplane is more like example 6 than it is like example 1. And that's why we don't have the same moral phenomenology, the sense of wrongness in this kind of case that we have in the clear cases of killing and harming people. Common sense morality does not hold us responsible for most behavior that contributes to climate change. That's the problem. So those of us who go around the world denouncing ourselves and others for behaving immorally, we're trying to get people to see things in that light, but that's not a way we actually at this point feel, given our morality. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why, and essentially what this slide does is to try to point out some differences between the cases that contribute to climate change and the kind of standard cases where morality gets a foothold. I'm not going to have time to talk about that now. Dan Gilbert, the psychologist from Harvard, points out that when people feel insulted or disgusted, they generally do something about it, such as whacking each other over the head or voting. Moral emotions are the brain's call to action, and although all human societies have moral rules about food and sex, none has a moral rule about atmospheric chemistry, right? It just doesn't engage with our morality. So this is a nice little slide about the poor polar bears who are trying to get people worked up about the Arctic. The only way they can do it is in the end by walking around with signs saying gay polar bears to marry, pro-life Eskimo swallowed by liberal orca, et cetera, et cetera. And essentially what this shows is that really what's threatening the polar bears doesn't engage people's moral sensibility, and in some way you have to distort the issue in order for it to begin to ring the bells of everyday common sense morality. Okay, then to conclude, essentially what I'm saying, and some of this I actually didn't say, is that evolution really did not build us to see these kinds of threats as urgent. So one thing I didn't talk about is that if carbon dioxide is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas. If carbon dioxide were sickly green and stunk to high heaven, we would have done something about it. Evolution didn't build us to deal with these kinds of threats. Our ethical systems are largely the legacies of low-density, low-technology societies. The 10 Commandments was essentially promulgated in a world of about 50 million people. And for reasons I haven't gone into, our economic and political systems are not designed to address this problem either. So what can we do? Well, obviously, again, child of the 60s that I am, expand our consciousness. We need to learn to empathize across the boundaries of space and time. The rhetoric in the environmental movement of thinking like a mountain is an attempt to do that. Obviously, we need to revise these notions of ethics and justice and moral responsibility so that they do encompass these new threats. And what would that take? Well, it would be nice to have some political leadership. It would be nice to have a better educational system that focused on this. Emerging social movements are very helpful in this regard, but all that's going to take time. And immediately what we need to do is to discourage, limit, and phase out the use of coal. That's the really straightforward thing we can focus on at this moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Dale. And as has been the case for the last 2 days, there's always the temptation to want to jump right in and ask questions, but we will hold them. And I'm very pleased that Russell Hardin is with us, and I will briefly introduce him, and then we'll hear his talk. Russell Hardin is the Helen Gould Shepard Professor in the Social Sciences and Professor of Politics at New York University since 1993. He was also Professor of Political Science at Stanford University from 2001 to 2003 and a visiting professor in 1999 to 2000. He is author of many books, including How Do You Know? The Economics of Ordinary Knowledge, Indeterminacy and Society, David Hume, Moral and Political Theorist, Indeterminacy in Society, Liberalism, Constitutionalism, and Democracy, and One for All, The Logic of the Group, Conflict. And we're very pleased to have him with us. Russell Hardin.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here, and I know I have a debt of gratitude to many people for its having happened, and I'll pretend that I get the pleasure of it at no cost, at least no cost to me. And I very much was interested in the topic and might have come to the conference independently, but came because I was invited, and have enjoyed meeting people, some of whose names I know very well from past encounters, and a couple of people who are in my university, but I don't get to see them there, like Dale. And so we see one another on the road. And that's like his example of our particular use of, or emission of, carbon from our travels to conferences around the world. And it probably adds up. I think that's probably, for me, the biggest contribution to the negative harm of pollution that I contribute. And so it's not a good thing that I do contribute it, but it's at least controllable. And I hope it will be controlled even better by the kinds of technological changes that are being made to make the harms less great. That's probably not too plausible a claim or expectation, however. Well, what I wanted to do in this particular paper was lay out the problems of collective action involved in lots of kinds of activities, and then compare them from the smallest activity, a two-person interaction, to the largest, our interaction with the globe, with the whole Earth, and to see what difference it made for motivational analysis of what you and I ought to do as a result of knowing those things. As Dale suggested, we probably know those things but don't do the things that we would like to have done by perhaps other people.
Could you speak louder?
Yes. Does it help to do this thing? Yes. Okay, sorry. Thank you. You'll have noticed that Dale referred to a couple of things, generational problems and so forth. John Rawls once, when asked what he thought of justice in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation from now, and he said, well, he couldn't actually think ahead. There would be so many changes between now and then for him to be able to make a judgment of what things would have been improved or harmed by the things that happen in the meantime. And he therefore said that his theory of justice needn't go beyond the third generation. Now, I don't know how casual that observation for him was. I don't think he wrote on the topic, but it's an interesting claim that we all live with, that in some way we are charging the environment and other people in the world a lot for our activities. I entitled this paper M.A.D. Those of you who were around for the pleasures of the nuclear portending disaster in the 50s, 60s, and so forth will recognize that as the so-called policy. It was never a policy, it was merely a fact of the way in which weapons were acquired and so forth, of the nuclear system. So that you and I would be participants in that, we would contribute to it, and we would mainly contribute to it indirectly through political office holders and so forth. In our time, we have a M.A.D. program. It has similar results. That is to say, it will cause harms that you and I will have to suffer, and the end result will be that we will all have made each of us suffer, so that there's a sense in which some of the problems I'm going to address in a moment are particularly onerous as cases in which billions of people do harm to billions of people. And we would rather eliminate the second half of that, at least. So the system of M.A.D. was not a policy, and the system of contemporary M.A.D. in which we destroy the environment in which we live, that's not intentional either. In fact, you couldn't begin to think of how you would lead your life radically differently that would make a difference there. There were many people back in the 60s who thought one way to lead your life safely without harming other people with all the things you do would be to live out in the country and shovel snow and all that stuff. Well, that's actually not true. I live in a high-rise apartment building in Manhattan, and I can turn the heat off often because it generates sufficient heat without furnaces being used. And everybody in that building has the same experience. There are days when it's not cold enough outside to penetrate into the inside of these apartments. And that's probably one of the solutions we have available to us to these kinds of problems. And then when we act, we don't necessarily, you and I, go out and act. Rather, we vote for candidates and so forth, and they act in our name to some extent. And when we have a policy about these things, we notice immediately that it's a two-tier policy. First, we adopt a policy. Second, we actually apply it in some way. And so when we're first adopting a policy, we run up against political struggles. When we then try to apply it, we run up against similar political struggles with the people who see themselves as harmed or not made better off, at least, in the regulation of these harmful things that we're dumping into the atmosphere. So there is this problem that is twice as bad as we might think, and we've got to beat it twice over. We've got to beat it in the policy formation stage. You'll recall the case I'll mention a little bit more later of southwestern Pennsylvania, the town of Donora in 1948, in which the people woke up in the morning to gagging in the fumes coming from the politics or the pollution of the U.S. Steel plant and various subsidiary plants. And in that case, 20 people died directly from the consequences of inhaling this stuff. And it was easy to show that that's actually what they had done. So in that community, on most days, it would have been not so dangerous to live there. On that particular day, it was dangerous. For actually several days in a row thereafter, it was dangerous because the weather condition had been really weird. There was an inversion so that the clouds up above are not being penetrated by the gases being blown off by the firms, the factories, and therefore the factories were polluting much more than they normally would have. They would have polluted as much stuff under normal circumstances, but it wouldn't have been as harmful. If we were, in some sense, trying to understand people who are opposed to this stuff that sounds like it's really straightforward. As Dale said, it seems to be a kind of thing that we all recognize. And it's not just we, but lots of people recognize it and wish it weren't happening or were happening less, are willing to do a little bit in their own lives to change how much impact they have, how much negative impact they have. They're not willing to go way out of the way, but they're willing to do some. And so if you walk into a store to buy a refrigerator, you'll see the one that's marked with the star, and you would wind up choosing it over the other available models that you would have. Well, here are the ranges of collective action that we face. You and I face all the time. The first is two-person. That's an exchange problem. I do something for you, you do something for me. Small number, on the order of 10 to 30 people, can typically operate relatively well, cooperate relatively well together in experiments that we run all over the place in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. And so that's another one that's an important one that we can manage. Then there are those islands and other communities that you may have read in the book of Collapse and how these things go wrong in those villages, in those tiny towns. The tiny towns are on the ocean. They're Pacific, South Pacific island communities, some of which are threatened with drowning sometime soon in the next 20 or 30 years. So those people are going to have to be moved from there to a safer place. And we, in fact, recognize that as harmful to the people of Easter Island, which may be damaged, but many other places that are going to be completely wiped out, we find painfully evident to us, and so we don't have to be taught anything. All we have to be done is motivated to do something about it, and we're not likely to do much of that. There are a few cases of thousands of people acting together, and even really large-scale actions. In the large-scale actions, there are, at the worst, whole society billions, as in the M.A.D. Arrangement in the 70s, 60s, 70s. And you'll remember that the person who brought it to end, or the two people who brought it to end, were Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev. And one of the reasons they both agreed to bring an end to the system of M.A.D. was that they both thought it was just ugly, the idea of threatening people with atomic weapons or nuclear weapons. And so it was easy for them to agree to get rid of it because the two of them were in agreement on that at the moment in which the policy change came about. So that was very important. Well, most of these things that we're referring to now are essentially problems that sound a little bit like the standard problem of collective action as analyzed by originally Mansur Olson and lots of other economists and others. And the collective action that we face is one in which we would like to produce a good for all of us, but if we don't coordinate successfully or cooperate successfully, we'll in fact do harm to our others. And so we would like to somehow get it to be the case that you and I cooperate in opposing the harms being done by these things being many, many other kinds of things, but the category is what we're interested in rather than a specific kind of thing that we have in any given case. So the use of federal money is to control these things, to come to study them, was called into question recently. You probably have all noticed. A congressional committee of Republicans mainly passed a resolution to be a part of a bill that would be adopted. It wasn't adopted because Democrats in the House, in the Senate and in the presidency weren't going to vote for it, but the thing said no federal monies can be used to study the hoax of global warming, so that you are barred by legislation in the United States. You are barred from being smart. You're forced to be stupid about these issues because no research being done means we will not know any better than we do already. There were other categories I might have mentioned, but I have a chart of all these things, and the chart gets more and more complicated the more I think about it. And the many things that fit in there, I think, are finally things we could do something about, but not very much. So consider one of these Pacific Island examples, like Easter Island and others, some of which are threatened with imminent destruction, others of which have slowly destroyed themselves, not by rising tides, but just by their own activities. They've killed the last tree growing from which they had to live, for example, so that they then are not going to survive much longer unless they get off their island and go elsewhere. Well, what happens is you and I have reasons to behave in ways that de facto get in the way of collective action. So we act through what sociologists would call collective behavior. Long before the analysis of collective action, there was a big literature on collective behavior, and that was largely seen as somehow negative, as self-destructive and so forth, so that the understanding of these movements, mass movements all over the place, does not necessarily turn over on whether the movements are beneficial to us, whereas in fact collective actions typically are about things that are beneficial to us. We might succeed, might not succeed, or we might succeed in handling those, but we at least know that it would be beneficial to us. So what we have in these Pacific Island places is you eat the last taro root that we have, and that's the end of it. I don't have any chance of eating taro root now. And so we both die along with the large population, not very large actually, in the tens in some cases, and the islands have been there for a long time with that. But Jared Diamond, in his account of all these societies, does the best job, I think, in his account of the collapse of these whole island societies, as opposed to some of the other things that he does, which are the collapse of Maya Empire and so forth, which were related and same kind of thing. Well, I mentioned Donora, this grim example of how it can go wrong. And the interesting thing about Donora is that it isn't the people doing it to themselves. They may benefit in some way from the larger social activities that led to Donora, but that's not the thing that really matters for them. What really matters for them is the harm done to their atmosphere by lots of other people. So there's a case in which the harm is done by a lot of people, and the benefit is suffered, or the harm is suffered by far fewer people. So that if we were trying to figure out what we want to resolve through public policy, having got over the first instance of getting together and succeeding in adopting a policy, and now facing the task of enforcing it as we have to go forward with that, we would look at cases like Donora and we would see that it's going to be hard to do this kind of thing. We could pass general policies. More than 2 decades after that happened, it was most of the reason for adopting Clean Air Act in the United States. So in the 23 years from the death of those people in Donora until a new regime was established, was a period in which a huge number of people passed away as new ones came in. So that's the kind of politics that we're up against. It might not actually come out so badly in some cases, but it comes out very badly in other cases. And Donora is also an interesting case of a harm that was corporate. It was a company, a corporate or a collective entity of some kind that did the harm, and they did it in their interest, but not in the interest of you and me if we happen to live in Donora and not work for those particular employers. So they, in fact, have no responsibility but lots of burden from the thing. So in the politics of corporate regulation, we're going to see extremely hard battles over the kinds of things that happen in Donora and that have happened historically for more than 1,000 years in London. London has twice shut down the burning of anything because it was under such grim cloud cover. In medieval times, the first time the shutdown happened, there have been shutdowns in other places. Harbin, China shut down for a day or two because the pollution was so bad that in fact it was going to be lethal for people to go to work. So everything was shut down and no cars were allowed to drive. So the problems that you and I face are mostly going to be how we survive some of this stuff when we can't control it, or how do we participate in the politics of a drafting legislation to control these things. We won't be doing the control. We will be doing this secondary thing, drafting legislation and passing the legislation. That's probably not going to happen at the moment in the United States. Maybe some of the other countries represented at this conference are going to be more intelligent about these policies than we are. But in fact, in our case, we have, in a sense, both the corporations that are involved and us are conflicted over how we're going to deal with those things. And there was a funny thing back in the 60s about a pollution issue that's not like this one, polluting the air that you or I breathe, but it was a pollution issue in a Dow chemical plant in which they were making something like saran wrap. And it turned out that the way they did that was with really vicious acids. And that meant it boiled off into the air that the workers were breathing. And in fact, they were suffering from the equivalent of hydrochloric acid burning. And the plant, when it was told by EPA that it had to change the way it worked, said, it can be done, you're going to close us down. And this went on for a couple of years, and the company refused, and finally the law was simply brought to bear no matter what they thought. And what did it do? It reduced the level of pollutants in the air while the manufacturing is taking place and reduce the cost of the manufacturing so that, in fact, Saran wrap and several other such things became more valuable products than they would have been without any intervention. And one would hope that, as in the case of some of the things Dale was mentioning, the fact that people stand to benefit from the changes may make it easier for us to somehow get the changes adopted. Corporations don't seem to be very quick learners on that. Maybe individuals will be more so, or at least groups like this will certainly be more so. So I hope to be at a future conference at which we've actually made some progress, but I don't see it anytime soon. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Eddie Bautista, is the Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, which advocates for the empowerment and just treatment of environmentally overburdened neighborhoods. In 2011, Eddie was invited by Governor Cuomo's office and the state legislature to provide advice over the reauthorization of New York State's power plant siting laws to protect overburdened communities from increases in local air pollution. He also directed a 2010 voter referendum campaign amending the city charter to include private infrastructure facilities on the city's fair share map. He also spoke at the White House's first forum on environmental justice. Eddie is the convener of the Sandy Regional Assembly, an association of environmental justice and community-based groups and labor allies from areas affected by Superstorm Sandy and those vulnerable to storm surges throughout the New York City, New Jersey, Long Island communities. He's worked with them to propose resiliency and rebuilding priorities for government review during the Sandy recovery process. Eddie also leads New York City's Environmental Justice Alliance's Waterfront Justice Project, a campaign to increase community resilience and climate adaptation along New York City's significant maritime industrial areas, which encourage the clustering of polluting infrastructure, heavy manufacturing, and industries in waterfront communities of color vulnerable to storm surges. Please welcome Eddie Bautista.
Hi, good afternoon. The New York City Environmental Justice Alliance is a citywide coalition of community-based organizations from the city's most environmentally overburdened communities. They are pretty much the communities that still have the bulk of the city's industrially zoned land, and land that still has. I mean, it kills me whenever I hear people talk about post-industrial New York. We still have tens of thousands of jobs and thousands of light manufacturing and other kind of heavy polluting uses clustered in a handful of communities. Our first exposure to climate change actually predates Sandy, predates Irene, predates the microburst, predates multiple nor'easters that increased in severity in the late 2000s, the 2 tornadoes that hit Brooklyn in 4 years. You actually have to go back to the 90s for from our perspective. In the 90s, that was the last time New York City updated its waterfront revitalization program, which is essentially the city's coastal zone management plan. And the coastal zone management plan essentially lays out permitted activities in different parts of the waterfront. So it kind of breaks down the waterfront into 4 broad categories. The redeveloping waterfront, which is also known as the gentrifying waterfront, the recreational waterfront, the industrial waterfront. I always blank on the 4th. In the 90s, they created a subset of the industrial waterfront called the significant maritime and industrial areas. What you see up on the screen are the 6 SMIAs. Now, I always have to caution people to understand that the environmental justice movement is not anti-industrial. In fact, we consider ourselves industrial retention advocates. There's got to be a place in this town where working people could still get a fair living wage, and the industrial sector, when compared to the sector, the compared to some of the retail sectors or the service industry, does pretty well for people without college degrees. But we also don't buy the old paradigm that in order to have economic development, you have to compromise environmental standards. The problem in the 90s was the introduction of the SMIAs in those 6 communities actually lowered environmental review for these communities. So when the Waterfront Revitalization Program was going through its review process, we tried to identify why these were actually environmentally disproportionately increasing the burden in certain communities, and that in fact that we needed to add certain environmental protections and reform measures to that designation. The problem is that the SMIAs were shepherded by the Giuliani administration, and about the only thing they were more hostile to than environmental protection was civil rights. You combined the two, and we were just dead in the water. So fast forward to 2010, which is the next time the city starts updating its waterfront revitalization program. With the Bloomberg administration, we figure we have a better shot at advancing this argument. But what we have in 2010 that we didn't have in the 90s was a climate change toolbox. And thankfully GIS mapping. What you see up on the screen is a mapping overlay we did of the New York State Office of Emergency Management storm surge projections mapped over the significant maritime and industrial areas. Again, there are 6 of them from top to bottom, A, B, C, et cetera. It's the South Bronx, Newtown Creek, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Red Hook, Sunset Park, and North Shore of Staten Island. What was, again, in hindsight should have been a surprise, but what was shocking to us was that every single one of our SMIAs were vulnerable to storm surges. And I'm not talking about Category 4. I'm not even talking Category 1. You know, again, severe weather storms, a stiff wind. I mean, our communities were vulnerable. So what we started doing was looking at deeper analyses, and from 2010 through 2012, we actually produced like 200 maps. What we did was we started looking at all the public, as many as we could get, you know, because there were a number of these databases we couldn't get access to, but we looked at about 20 government public databases of public agencies that give environmental permits. I'm not going to go through the 200 maps, let me just give you a sampling of a couple of them. This is a map of the EPA's Community Right to Know Act. These are facilities that, under the toxic release inventory, have to report to the EPA. The kinds of facilities or the kinds of substances that are associated with some of these facilities you see on the left hand of the screen include dioxin, N-hexane, naphthalene. To zoom in on, again, this one data set and one community, let's look at Sunset Park. Sunset Park is the largest of the SMIAs, and in fact, as you see to the top of the screen, actually, it actually embraces part of Red Hook. Red Hook has its own SMIA, but the Sunset Park SMIA actually has a part of Red Hook's as well. If you looked at, for example, the TRI, the Community Right to Know Act, of the 234 facilities in New York City, 17 of them, or 7%, are both vulnerable to storm surge and located within a half mile of the SMIA. Those are the blue dots that you see. I should just point out the solid black outline are the actual contours of the SMIA. The dotted line was, we decided let's look at a half-mile radius to see how far out from the SMIAs, and we picked a half mile because, as a rule of thumb, that's kind of what SEQRA, the Cities and State Environmental Quality Review Act, when environmental impact statements are studied, they generally look at a half-mile radius, so we decided to look at that. To give you another, by the way, one of the facilities, for example, that's associated with these uses in Sunset Park is an electric power generator. And it's a power generator, a power plant where the presence of N-hexane has been documented, which is a special health hazard that can cause reproductive damage, and high exposures can lead to unconsciousness and death. And I want to state the obvious. The reason why we started looking at this is, you know, we'd like to think if we were designing a city from scratch today, we'd be smarter than putting all our heaviest polluting infrastructure on the waterfront. New York is not unique in that. I mean, you know, historically, the waterfront is where you put all your, this notion of luxury development on the waterfront is a relatively recent expression in human history. For most of human-built history, you put all your nasty stuff on the waterfront. Your infrastructure, your manufacturing, your immigrants, your people of color, that's what you would put on the waterfront, right? So we started wondering, well, what does it mean about communities that are vulnerable to storm surge and have these concentrations? Let's look at another example. This is another database. This is the state's active chemical bulk and major oil storage facilities. These are facilities that handle hazardous substances or store 400,000 gallons of oil or more. Some of the hazardous substances associated with these uses are naphthalene, benzene, copper-cyanide, mercury. Again, let's look at one of the SMIAs. This is the South Bronx. Of the 171 facilities in this category of database, 18 of them, or 11%, are both vulnerable to storm surge and located within a half-mile of the South Bronx SMIA. One of these uses is a petroleum bulk station and terminal where the presence of naphthalene has been documented, and naphthalene is considered a carcinogen that can be absorbed through the skin that can damage vision, kidneys, and the liver. Just to give you an example of just a few more of the data sets, this is just like 3 more of the data sets. This includes the EPA Community Right to Know Act. This includes waste transfer stations. The South Bronx has, despite having less than 5% of the city's population, handles over 25% of the city's solid waste. I want to point everyone to the square in the middle of all those data points. That square is the Hunts Point Food Market. Excuse me. The Hunts Point Food Market actually is the region's breadbasket. It feeds about 22 million people in this region. It generates over $3 billion a year in revenues. It employs over 20,000 people, both directly and indirectly. The mayor's office, the SIR, has already confirmed that had Sandy struck when high tide was hitting the Long Island Sound, which is the body of water that surrounds the South Bronx, had those 2 events coincided, they've confirmed that the Hunts Point Food Market would have been disrupted and our food supply would have been disrupted for the region for nobody knows how long. So if you don't care anything about the South Bronx, think about where you get your food. Think about how nasty the fights were for gas lines, and think about what cutting off food for New Yorkers will be like after a few days. So who's affected? We looked at the sum total of New Yorkers that live within a half-mile of the SMIAs. It's something like on the order of 622,600 New Yorkers, basically the equivalent of the population of Washington, D.C., lives within a half-mile of these SMIAs. Of that 622,000, over 430,000 are people of color. And this is all talking about the research that we were doing pre-Sandy. What's clear is that not just this, but there are a number of other indicators where, and I'll get to the next slide in a second, about how climate change is going to affect everyone, but the impacts are not going to be equally felt. And just to put a final note on this research, just because we have these industrial clusters in storm surge areas, we're not implying that everyone's going to be exposed and, run for the hills. But we do need to do further research. So we've partnered with the RAND Corporation and Lifeline Group to start looking deeper and look at, chemical source point dislodgeability and water infringement scenarios. And I got to tell you, all kinds of stuff that's like gobbledygook. But we're basically trying to look at what's at least superficial risks and try to get a sense of, well, what does it mean under different potential storm surge scenarios? And this was all before Sandy, right? So this, those of you may remember this map. This is from the New York Times. It shows you the storm surges from Sandy. Obviously, the worst impacts for Sandy did not hit the SMIAs, although I will tell you most of the SMIAs experienced flooding. In fact, the Sunset Park SMIA actually had a spill at the local power plant. So just to give you a sense of, even with these SMIAs not being the epicenter of Sandy, the mayor's office has confirmed that 800 industrial businesses, about half of the businesses impacted in the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront, were industrial firms. Putting aside the issue of SMIAs, if you look at public housing, 20% of public housing properties were impacted, about 35,000 units, 402 buildings. If you look at just renters and even owners, 64% of the renters that were impacted in New York City, and 30% of owners impacted in New York City had yearly household incomes below $30,000 a year. So even with Sandy, there was a clear disproportionality in terms of the impacts. This is Sandy hitting the Red Hook SMIA. Actually, this is the one that shares the SMIA with Sunset Park. Those of you who go to Red Hook, Fairway, these are the Civil War era warehouses that are right across the street from Fairway. It's about 98% occupied, all small industrial uses. In fact, that first floor has a print shop with a lot of, and the point that we always try to make to people is that these businesses are not nefarious. These are simple manufacturers, people that are doing legally kind of permitted work, employing people locally. It's not that they're doing anything bad, it's just that no one ever expected Buttermilk Channel to come roaring through their place of business. And you should note that this is daylight hours, right? You can see the sunlight. This was before the worst of Sandy. That kind of like the little fence that you see dividing the waterway, that's usually the sidewalk. So you just know that when the worst of Sandy hit 3 or 4 hours later, it was exponentially worse. So we have a saying in the environmental justice movement that if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? So we recognized that we needed to do proactive planning after Sandy hit. We couldn't wait for government to do the planning. In fact, we needed to do planning to articulate our priorities to then be able to hold government accountable. Because you can't very well just complain about government's response if you don't have at least your own wish list, if you will. I won't go into the details of it, but the Sandy Regional Assembly, which is what we ended up calling this gathering, it was a gathering of nearly 200 people from the 5 boroughs, New Jersey, Long Island. Something like 40 community-based organizations came together and spent the day in this visioning process. I won't go through the details. If you go to our website, you'll see the agenda itself. Essentially, the community groups identified close to about $500 million of capital infrastructure projects. There were a lot of green infrastructure projects that were meant to add to the community's adaptation and resiliency, and were projects that government were already partnering with communities. These were among the projects that we were proposing be targeted for Sandy recovery. And then there were a lot of policy buckets. Policies looking at not just rebuilding on regional priorities, but making sure that these regional priorities reflected some of the local concerns. What we did with this recovery agenda was then we briefed the mayor's office, we briefed Secretary Donovan and the Federal Sandy Task Force, and we did all this in anticipation of the government reports. We then took our report and then analyzed government's response to Sandy and tried to measure how responsive they were to our agenda. This is the one we did of the mayor's SIRR. Again, that's on our website. And we noted a number of positive accomplishments that the plan did, not the least of which is looking at a number of neighborhood-specific interventions rather than the big splashy, just looking at barriers, for example. But then there were moments when they missed their own opportunities. For example, we applauded them when they talked about the millions of dollars of capital investment they were proposing for public housing. But what we were encouraging them was to look at it a little more broadly. Look at it, we challenged them to look at it more like a modern-day WPA. Look at the rebuilding in public housing. Look at the work opportunities that can afford people for public housing. Look at something called Section 3, which is a federal regulation under HUD that essentially urges that when you have this federal capital expenditures in federal properties, that you need to try to maximize local hiring opportunities. And that was an example where the mayor's office fell short, didn't quite embrace Section 3, so we took it further. We went to the federal task force and we briefed, as I said, Secretary Donovan and his people. And what was great about the federal response is that it actually picked up some of the things that were missing from the mayor's plan, including encouraging the use of Section 3 in Sandy rebuilding and public housing. Past the planning and the kind of the planning stages, our members are looking at the Sandy rebuilding itself. And one of the many kind of ways that rebuilding is happening around the city is the Rebuild by Design competition. And one of the things, we actually briefed a number of the teams, and what was really great to see was that some of the teams actually embraced the issue of industrial waterfronts and proposed mitigations along those lines. But for us, even the Rebuild by Design, at moments, our kind of advocacy has felt like shifting chairs on the Titanic a little bit, right? It's felt like, we're doing this stuff to make sure that our communities are no more vulnerable than they are. But this definition of resiliency, at least the common definition of communities being able to bounce back, that kind of feels hollow to communities that were disproportionately affected before severe weather events. I mean, for us, it's bounce back to what, right? Bounce back to an inequitable system where your communities are disproportionately environmentally burdened. Bounce back to a system where Hunts Point, for example, at one time had a childhood hospitalization asthma rate 12 times the national average. for us, it's not about bouncing back, it's about bouncing forward, right? So as we're looking at the rebuilding plans unfold, we realized that we had to go deeper and broader. And the IPCC report, I think, was a real eye-opener to a lot of folks. And one of the things that we heard about 2 months ago was that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has actually challenged world leaders to come to the UN September 23rd, I guess in advance of the Paris conversations that'll happen next year. And it's going to happen at the tail end of the UN General Assembly. So on September 23rd, the Secretary General has challenged world leaders to come together to talk and spend a one-day summit talking about climate change. And for us, we realized that combined with September 23rd being about 2 months before the congressional midterms was just too sweet an opportunity for us to miss out. So on September 20th, 21st, that weekend, we're still negotiating with the police department, so I can't tell you exactly when. We've just launched the People's Climate March. It's the first time that environmental justice, anti-fracking, labor unions, people from the Global South, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, for example, folks from other parts of the United States are going to be converging on New York to send the kind of message that, at least for the last 2 days, I've been hearing everybody want to send, which is to make sure that world leaders and Congress take this seriously. We've partnered with 350.org, environmental groups. The whole idea is to not just have the choir show up. The intention is to have the largest climate change march in US history. It doesn't take much, by the way. Our estimate of the largest one has been about 60,000 at 350 organized over the Keystone Pipeline last year. So 350 thinks that we can, I think that New York and our friends from across the country and the Global South, I think we can easily beat 60,000. So for those of you who are interested in participating, your organizations, your student organizations, whomever, please visit the website you see on the screen. We've only got 5 months, and 5 months is really not a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Our final speaker, before we open it up to questions, is Claire Weisz. Claire is FAIA and is founder principal of WXY Architecture and Urban Design, which focuses on creating innovative public spaces, structures, and cities. WXY's work includes the creative envisioning of new waterfronts, civic architecture, adaptive reuse, and urban revitalization efforts. Frequently cited in the media and professional circles, Claire has served on numerous design, award, and competition juries and was co-editor of A.D. Magazine's Extreme Sites, Greening the Brownfield Issue. She's a registered architect in California, New York, and New Jersey. Among other public recognitions, WXY has won AIA New York Chapter Merit and Honor Awards and was selected as one of the Architecture League's Emerging Voices in 2011. Please welcome Claire Weisz.
Well, I want to thank Arian and the New School for having me here. And it's a huge honor to actually talk about design in a context that is basically one that usually designers aren't in, which is the meat of design, which is how do we all make decisions as individuals or in groups, and who are we making decisions with, for, about, and that's, I think, the crux of it. So in a sense, I'm hoping that some of the things I'm talking about actually are picking up on themes that we've heard in the last 3 presentations. So luckily, Eddie was right in front of me, Eddie Bautista, because this rebuild by design, in a sense, was invented based on, I think, both pressure and hope on the part of HUD, that because no one understood the questions, it was pretty hard to predict the answers, and that maybe designers or the design competition format might provide some hopes to things that went beyond recovery, but went more to the task of what are we supposed to be doing with a dilemma that seems insurmountable. So that's of course, there's something about the United States where we think that the technology or the thinking might be somewhere else, so we're here at asking the Dutch to help us. So while this has all been going on, and clearly since well before even the 1990s, but definitely 1990s, it has struck people because people only really understand from events. So here I am as an architect in the new school who houses Parsons, explaining to people that the economy and the environment are connected. Every single one of you could cite about 18 examples just from this week for yourselves. But it was a revelation, I think, for Coca-Cola to realize that a series of drought years that were happening, I believe it was in South Asia in particular, was completely tearing apart their profit line in terms of Coke sales. But so now we actually have what I would call the mainstream press understanding this fact. It also, I think, hasn't hit a lot of people that whether you're renting or owning, whether you have or do not have insurance, that you're all connected. You may be the only business that got back on the street, but if no one is coming to buy your coffee, you will go out of business soon. And the same thing for this idea that our city boundaries actually mean anything. Most of the jobs that are coming through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel that are keeping a lot of corporations affordable because they can rely on the fact that South Jersey has cheaper housing than most of New York City. And then finally, what does it mean when New York City below 49th Street is actually out of power for 7 days? You can only imagine the fridges, the people like me who lost months of data, and everyone else who has a story. Those lost opportunity costs are not in any of the charts that you're seeing today on economic figures predicted for the future, because in most cases, only a couple of private sources are starting to develop databases that can handle this sort of modeling. And yes, those are pilot whales, but even in this region, we are finding that the ecological costs only are becoming meaning to people when they on an event basis, but not the incremental change that's so difficult. And again, we've heard from experts for the last 2 days the reality of this. But as in terms of the day-to-day, there are huge pieces on our waterfronts that will be, and this was just Sandy. And Sandy just evokes very clearly the 100-year floodplain. I mean, it's almost one-to-one, except for a couple of cases. That wasn't projected to 2050. So one of the things that I had the opportunity to lead a Rebuild by Design team, and it was really because of working in New York City, I tend to be extremely locally based, that over and over again, people would come to community meetings and say, that's great, you're building this dune on my beach, but what's happening? Doesn't this mean that where you don't build the dune, it's going to be worse? Or people would say, you know, if this project over here in Lower Manhattan gets all the money, what about us in the Bronx? Or what about the subway that connects all of us? Are you going to ever raise the subway that's going to the Rockaways? Yeah, notice the subway got put back in the Rockaways in exactly the same place it already was. No one knows where the money is going to come to raise it. So there wasn't enough data. There was enough data to have a discussion about a larger solution, whether it was a gate, whether it was, you know, reinventing Saran wrap, but just for New York City, because New York City is wealthy enough as a city to pay for data and to commission reports. What about the rest of the region? All of these SIR maps show New Jersey as though no one is living or working there. Never mind Connecticut, which doesn't seem to exist either. So what happened is that we realized that the New York City there's basically 2 catastrophe modeling companies that provide data to all of the insurance companies in, well, really, I say the United States, but really the world, because most of these companies are global. And one of them is AIR, whose parent company happens to be in New Jersey. And for reasons unbeknownst to us, they essentially agreed to do some basic modeling for us and to provide data. So one of the things that they came up with, which no one else has come up with before, is that for Sandy, before Sandy, if you just thought about commercial and residential real estate, what was at risk in the inundated areas was $470 billion. Just stuff. So that doesn't include all the things I just listed in those pictures. It's very clear then, when you see charts like this about the rising cost of storms, what that means. And the question is why? And all of the experts for the last 2 days probably have different versions about why. But as an architect and designer, I'm looking at this as a fact, program. They're more expensive. So it means that this dream, right, that adding value to daily life is connected to what you actually put to protect communities, which means not being cut off with the water, adding value, and that somehow that there's a way to pay for it actually has to start somewhere. So for Rebuild by Design, this started with understanding that wind and wind-driven water are basically, whether it's due to climate change or not, and our interviews show that overwhelmingly what we know is the volatility is there, the incidences are there, and that it doesn't actually matter. These storms, if you can't predict it when they're coming, you still have to prepare for them. And the Dutch actually are very smart this way. They have the 1 in 1,000, and I think they're upping it now, which is you plan for something that has a very low probability of risk, and that's like 1,000 years. It's not 1 every 100. So the 1 in 100, a physicist who is on our team had a great way of looking at it. He goes, that's like the probability of having twins. So how many people in this room know a twin? And this is actually an everyday occurrence, to point this out. So we have a very shallow, in our region, we're sort of a coastal shed that all of us states, a very shallow region. So when water accumulates, right, on the seafloor, the waves ride up, and basically you can predict, the physics are there, these surges. So, but we have a huge complicated shoreline with access by, at least 4,000 miles of it. So in the end, if we're going to just build these walls because they're cheaper than actually figuring out complex kinds of levees and greenways, we're still talking about something that right now is 17 feet. And so we're talking about, in aggregate, about 10 feet levees or walls in front of all of our waterfronts, whether they're temporary or permanent. So I think we have to ask ourselves, as designers, as scientists, as policymakers, isn't there an option other than building big green walls or concrete walls? And actually, one of them that's come up lately was someone who was in dialogue with our team and showed us a lot of data specific to the region, that Dr. Christine Archer out of Delaware, that literally wind turbines, because of their wakes, and when wind turbines aren't spinning, when they're just, the blades are there, can reduce hurricane winds. They also happen to have this huge advantage, which is you're starting to look at even another reason why to fund wind turbine farms off the coast of the mid-Atlantic. So by her calculation, if you had a line of wind turbines in the sort of what I call the apex, the New York Bight, you could have cut the surge down by 2.5 feet without building anything else. So that would have been a huge savings. And right now, the idea of building, whether it's throwing sand on barriers, building walls, there's a lot of problems for all sorts of people and birds, which is every time you go out and disturb these environments, there are tertiary effects, including even for the surfers, because as you change their beaches, the surf becomes less predictable. So this is a little bit, this is back to the kind of analysis AR did. And They did the analysis on an idea which was, if you look at where the coastline of the mid-Atlantic was 5 to 10,000 years ago, it was out about 10 to 12 miles out from where it is today. I mean, our barrier islands were out there. So if you think about adaptive reuse and looking at very, very old ideas, the idea of building not a gate, but in fact looking at dunes, uninhabited lands, ecological lands, 6 to 10 miles out, is actually an idea that translates to, and again, this is just private and commercial property, not infrastructure, a decrease in losses of 18.7 billion for one incident. And for those economists out there, they know that that means huge amounts of money. A 15.99% reduction in losses it aggregates to just, you know, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars over time, over many incidents. So what would it take to actually create new habitat out there? Clearly, it would be larger than, you know, what the Netherlands Coastal Works is doing, but, you know, by a factor of. It would mean a huge amount of jobs for the shipbuilding industry, because our shipbuilding industry right now spends most of their time basically doing sand nourishment. They don't have the boats. And when we had a discussion, a very valuable discussion actually, when we send our data to John Seau, who basically invented the catastrophe bond. And he looked at all the data, and I said, well, you know, you might be able to do some of these islands for $4 to $6 billion. And his response was, are you serious? The real objective here is to do them, but to create jobs. And no industry is going to look at any project that's under $10 to $12 billion. This has to work at a larger scale. And that was interesting because in our discussions with completely responsible public bodies and states, they're always going smaller, smaller, scalable. So I'm here to say today, maybe scalable is something we should all question. And then, so that's the sort of view, you know, the artist-rendered view. But really the intention is, can we, us landscape architects, planner, talk about actually benefits that wouldn't segregate between states and communities? And can we talk about, that might not even exist like these islands. It might turn out that it's wind turbines. And can we, in the end, look at our flyways and our habitats and something that, as we do things incrementally, will never make up for the huge losses that are happening. So then we get back to this human scale, which is the other part of what we kept looking at, and which is why we thought it was so important to look at the issue of essentially everyone, was that every community is different. If you look at the same data, the graphic designer on our team did a series of video interviews in Hoboken, and she created these essentially photo montages based on the actual data that Stevens Institute collected during Sandy. And she superimposed them about bringing really this reality every day to people. And I think it's almost equally important that if we actually do think or have the models that we're talking about here, integrating public and private resources into transparent models for the region, including ecological models, we have to tell everyone about it. And we have to really use what we have to see design, and here's our flood level at this drugstore, see design as something that happens every day. And this is really to get back to the paradigm issue, at least among discussions, which is, are we looking at policies to move everyone away from the shore? Or are we accepting that an urbanized ocean that we have, you know, from Long Beach to Seabright and on, should actually be seen as a huge resource? We live in apartments, we work and we play here, and we have to find a way to actually make it better to be here, but on many counts. And in a lot of ways, I guess we tracked that it would take all of these things, but there's a chance that some, like I think the Saran Wrap example was amazing, there's a chance that this kind of investment, when the insurance industry can actually predict risk, that this kind of investment is actually something that could then reap lowered insurance rates, but also money back into our system. So we could be looking at new systems for insurance. And I wanted to stop there. I have a couple more minutes? Okay, then I'll show one kind of, just a little bit of background about, on a more technical level, that these efforts, like Marco, really looking at this sort of what are the same kind of mapping that we have for our subways in our cities is not available in the Mid-Atlantic right now. As much as scientists are trying to work together, the kind of funding isn't really there. And the funding has California, a little bit of Rhode Island, but even this, it's hard to do if you don't really know enough. And so I sort of am putting out there those last slides. Thank you.